Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, today's video comes from a viewer suggestion over on Discord, of course, because that is where I take the video suggestions that you all want to share with me. And the suggester wanted to explain why this video would be relevant because here's the title: The Absolute Worst Scientist of All Time and Why He's Popular Again. Now that sounds super interesting. I mostly focus on historical things, but they explained to me that what this scientist apparently is responsible for is the incredible famines that happened during the Great Leap Forward in China, as well as the famines that happened under the Stalin years. Now I've taught and have studied about a lot of the political and economic decisions that led to a lot of those famines, but apparently there's also like a scientific reason why these food shortages happened. So this channel is called Joe Scott. He's very popular. He's got 1.7 million subscribers. Can't say that I have seen him before, but just based off of what I've been told, this could be a really useful historical concept to share. Before we check this out though, make sure you support the original link that's going to be down below. Support the channel, give it a thumbs up. All right, let's get started. All right, Joe, what do you know? Yeah, that was cringe. Oh, well.
My parents would whip out. When I was a kid, there was a phrase that my parents would whip out whenever I was being a picky eater. They'd say, "Eat, Joe, there are starving children in China," which meant either...
By the way, when I think of that, hear that, I think of A Christmas Story. Remember when they're eating and the little boy wouldn't eat?
You should be grateful to get this food because there's some people out there who don't get it. Or something more like, this is food that could be going to a starving kid, and if you don't eat it, you're literally taking food out of a starving child's mouth. You're killing some kid in China if you don't eat this.
Let's be honest, if our parents ever said that, and if they did, okay, did that ever change it? You're like, no, Mom, it's still broccoli. Why are you feeding me poison?
Yeah, in my house, every entree was served with a side order of shame. Shame. How do you like your shame, mashed or au gratin? But this wasn't just my house. This was everywhere. This was the thing that parents would say to kids when they wouldn't eat. There are starving kids in China. So my impression of China when I was a kid was that it was just like this destitute wasteland just littered with starving children. Yeah. I imagine them like sitting at a dilapidated table, slicing up a single bean like that Disney cartoon. It was only much later that I found out that there was no...
It's like those Disney cartoons. I've covered them on this channel. Have you ever seen the ones from... the like World War II era where they would make like Disney would make like anti-fascist cartoons, and that was always the or even communist, I guess, but yeah, especially anti-fascist ones where they would do that.
Major food shortage in China. They were fine. So what was that about? Turns out it's because when my parents were kids, there very much were starving kids in China.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever actually looked into the Great Chinese Famine? Because 30
million probably at least died.
Holy crap, dude.
Like
it's
3
estimated
years.
up to 55 million people died from starvation between the years 1959 and 1961.
Yeah, I remember the curricular materials that I've seen. I don't know if they put it that high, but I mean, it's insane. Like, I don't care what you do. It's going to be more people than like died in World War II, like any country, like any two countries. And it's not going to be, and it's not going to possibly reach, the death of one famine in 3 years. Just like wrap your mind around that.
Yeah, that's 3/4 the number of people who died worldwide in World War II. In one country.
You nailed it. Yeah.
In 3 years.
Yep.
Yeah. Try to guess what happened on this graph.
Oh, look at that.
You see it?
That's insane.
It's pretty subtle. But this story isn't about the Great Chinese Famine. It is about one of the people who was responsible for it. A scientist whose backwards ideas about plants also helped create the Soviet famine, the Kazakh famine, and the Holodomor in Ukraine. And a guy who incredibly...
Okay, so Holodomor, that's the famous one in Ukraine. Millions died under the Stalin years, something that Ukrainian history and the Ukrainian present has held on very dear to their history. And they're just, among other things, their disdain for their history under Soviet and Russian occupation and pressure. But then also what happened in China, so...
is gaining in popularity in some places.
Why did this guy have a job? Oh, he's getting popular again.
In 1924, after a series of strokes, the founder of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, died. And in his wake, Joseph Stalin stepped in to lead the country. And of course, by stepped in, I mean he destroyed the old leadership by charging them with bogus crimes, systematically arresting and executing them. Stalin. Yeah. He became known as the Great Purge, which...
completely derailed everything that so many of the revolutionaries were out to, and changed his whole perspective. He changed the whole like interpretation and goal of the earlier Marxists in Russia. You know, someone like Lenin he was about what kind of Marx was a little bit more advocating for, which was like global workers' revolution. And Stalin was like, nah, screw the rest of the world. Let's just focus on us at all expense, even the death of millions.
Any event in history that's described as a purge is generally not a good time. But Stalin had big ideas to reshape the Soviet Union based on his own nationalistic brand of Marxism that he called socialism in one country.
By the way, the purge, because, you know, trying to interject the history here, the purge, Stalin was insanely paranoid and also believed that he needed to really trim the fat for his plan of the future of the Soviet Union was going to happen. Millions died, right? We don't know exactly, at least probably a couple. And what was insane about, what interesting part about that, if you didn't know, is his focus on the military. He purged the military. About half of the military leadership of the Soviet Union, okay, was purged, eliminated by Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, basically Lenin was more concerned with spreading communism around the world, but Stalin just wanted to focus on strengthening the Soviet Union.
One country.
Yeah, at this point, the Industrial
Communism,
Revolution
one
had been
country.
going on for decades, but Russia had really fallen behind Europe and the rest of the world in that regard, especially around agriculture. So Stalin began a series of
and that goes back pre-Soviet Union, pre-Stalin. That goes back to the monarchy era. They had not industrialized effectively or efficiently. They were still using peasant labor, literally peasants. Well, they freed the serfs or whatever, but they were peasants, right? Way behind. And Stalin, you guys know, if you don't know, Stalin's not his real name. It means man of steel. And for multiple reasons, but one of the reasons you can add to that is he was an industrialist, and he wanted to push a push the NOS button on industrializing Russia to make it like overnight almost try to go from basically a non-industrialized nation to like that of the United States. And it succeeded, by the way, at incredible cost.
5-year plans to help industrialize the country. He was basically worried that if the Soviet Union didn't modernize, then communism would fail, and then that would allow its capitalist neighbors to destroy the country.
You've got to look good if you want your ideas to look good.
That he started basically continued until the end of the Soviet Union up in the 90s. They weren't all 5 years. Some were 4, the longest was 7. But yeah, by the time the Soviet Union fell, they were in the middle of their 12th plan. I
actually didn't know it went up to 12. The first 2 are talked about a lot, and they met their quotas, actually exceeded them of what they were trying to do. The 5-year plan was like, hey, in 5 years, here's where we want to be production-wise for agriculture or steel production, whatever it was. And it's like you do, and you had insane pressure pushed down from the top from Stalin himself for everybody in that chain of command. You reach that quota, and there is no failure accepted.
So in many ways, this actually worked. They saw massive economic growth in coal, oil, and steel productivity.
It worked.
But it was brutal.
Right.
Yeah, factories were given these insane goals that were almost impossible to meet. And the punishment, if you failed to meet that goal, you didn't just get fired. You were branded an enemy of the state and imprisoned
to the gulag.
Executed.
To the gulag.
Layoffs are bad, but that's
Can you imagine that? Like today, you get fired for your job. Like if you're a manager, right? In the Stalin era, if you did bad at your job, you went to prison. You were seen as a criminal, not just a bad leader, like a bad boss.
And then he wanted to collectivize the farms, and that was another big part of his 5-year plan. He thought that, if the country was going to industrialize, he would have a lot of mouths to feed. So he wanted to increase the agricultural productivity, and he thought the best way to do that was to, basically turn all the individually owned farms under the authority of the state. And there was this one specific...
A lot of people thought that's what happened originally with Lenin, but Lenin actually let a lot of private ownership happen under that era. But yeah, Stalin's like, nope, collectivize all of it, and we will be able to mass produce out of it. By the way, similar thing you're going to see in China.
A group of especially wealthier farmers called kulaks.
Sorry, I might be talking too much.
Most of his ire on. About 5 million of them were deported, or just
they were the threats.
Disappeared.
They were the threats.
So, yeah, imagine you've been running a farm for generations, growing and selling your crops, and then the Soviet army comes in all...
If you were lucky to own
I like
land.
that. I'm going to steal it. That's mine now.
But yeah, because of that, I think, understandably, there was a lot of resistance from farmers. Some farmers went to the extent of actually killing all their animals and destroying their crops rather than let the state have them. So that itself caused disruptions in the food supply. But far worse than that was that when the state took over these farms, they changed how they ran them. So again, they wanted to increase productivity, and to do that, you've got to do things differently. And Stalin had just the guy in mind to find this new way.
well, in the economic plan, we call this a command economy. It's what Stalin did to the economy. His goal, okay, was to put the entire major economic decisions in the hands of the government. Took away a lot of the influence of the people that had been on those lands, right? Which is why people really criticize Stalin as being almost like anti-socialist in a way, where it's supposed to be the people, the workers, right, own and operate the means of production. And that was not the case at all for people under the Stalin era.
Stalin had become impressed by the ideas of a prominent scientist named Trofim Lysenko, a man whose policies would lead to waves of famines across multiple countries. Lysenko was born in Ukraine to a peasant family in 1898. He only learned to read and write at age 13. Okay. He graduated from the Uman School of Horticulture in 1921 and the Kyiv Agricultural Institute in 1925.
He's educated.
There he worked on plant breeding experiments at an agricultural station. His first published papers appeared in 1923. He didn't know any foreign languages and he had to learn everything through translations. Now, anywhere else in the world, this might have been an issue, that he had limited access to international science developments, but in the Soviet Union, at that time anyway, that was considered a plus. They wanted to promote homegrown.
Oh yeah, looks like you can say early Soviet Union thought it's like everyone else is the stupid ones, right? Everyone else is stupid. Let's go ahead and hone in. We can answer these
scientists, and the more underprivileged their upbringing, the better. Because, they were all about the working class.
Right.
But it was an article published in Pravda, the Communist Party's official newspaper, in 1927 that launched his career. The article covered a paper that he had published that year that proposed a new way of increasing plant productivity called vernalization. Vernalization is when you artificially expose plants or seeds to temperatures that are colder than normal to help stimulate flowering or maybe increase seed production.
Let me read this. Again, vernalization, exposing plants to artificial cold to stimulate flowering or seed production. Is that because it's like, so like seeds know when it's time to start doing seed stuff, right? And temperature, like, obviously has an impact on that, as I'm just thinking out loud with, the seasons, how the seasons work. And I've heard that if like global temperatures and stuff continue to like be erratic, if they become erratic or continue to become erratic, that could really mess up agriculture, because stuff is going to start to germinate early or whatever, and then it won't be able to handle the climate conditions and all that. So I guess I see where this guy's going. It's like trick the seed into starting its work.
For example, he claimed in his paper that he took winter wheat seeds and exposed them to cold temperatures, which made them more productive in the spring. But his research was deeply flawed. It wasn't done with proper controls or run through statistical analysis.
Bad science.
It's not like people didn't know about this method. Farmers have been using it since the 19th century. And botanists have been studying this for at least 10 years before Lysenko, so he wasn't really breaking new ground or anything like that.
It's just that he gets to actually do it.
But the Soviet leadership liked his beliefs.
On a large
scale. They especially
scale.
liked that he was a hardcore communist who hated the West. So Stalin appointed...
Man, they kind of show that, you show that like, in the communist years, especially with someone like Stalin very much was about loyalty and people you could trust. So like the more butt you kissed, the more hardcore you were, the more privileges you're going to get, regardless of actually how skilled you are at the thing that you're, supposed to be good at. It's a sign of authoritarianism that we've seen throughout in history, where those kind of people surround themselves with yes men and give them privileges based off of that alone, rather than demonstrated skill. Not a meritocracy. What do we call it when it's just, not necessarily nepotism, but just kiss buttery.
Appointed him the director of the Institute of Genetics of the Academy of Sciences in the USSR and the president of the V.I. Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Yeah, so he was like the guy. And as the guy, he wielded his power like a good authoritarian, and he made an enemy out of anybody who questioned his research.
Oh, great.
And of course, what happens to enemies of the state in Stalin's Soviet Union? They were imprisoned or executed. His biggest critic was an agronomist and a geneticist named Nikolai Vavilov.
The science community did not support him.
Okay, so let's step back for a second.
This is setting
what were
up
these
bad.
beliefs exactly? What was it that the Soviet leadership had hung their hat on with this guy? First of all, he rejected the science of genetics, specifically as developed by Gregor Mendel and Thomas Hunt Morgan. Yeah, probably not.
Gosh, we all learned that in our biology classes our freshman year, right? Gregor Mendel, like the idea of opening up genetics into the study for agriculture, it's completely shaped our world. It's why people live longer and our population is literally like exponentially growing, is because the science has been clear about how you breed plants and all this stuff and how you can like intervene with that. And this is so anti-science.
Great when the director of the Institute of Genetics didn't believe in genetics. He thought this brand of science was idealistic, impractical, and a product of bourgeois capitalism. Like Andrew Carnegie decided how genes should be passed or something. Lysenko instead followed the work of a Russian naturalist named Ivan V. Mishurin.
We're dealing with so many logical fallacies right now.
A neo-Lamarchian form of evolution. Lamarchianism is named after a French naturalist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who theorized in 1809 that physical changes to organisms during their lifetime can be transmitted to their offspring. Yeah, this was the early...
So yeah, Lamarckian, basically like Darwinism for speciation replaced Lamarckianism. Lamarckianism is basically like the giraffe reaches so high to get to the higher leaves that its, you know, neck is going to increase. Therefore, and once he does that enough, then the child giraffe will do that too. So like you extend your neck in your lifetime, that means the next, you know, your offspring is immediately going to have that. Maybe if you lift weights and you're buff, even if you started as a weakling, naturally your kid is going to be buff. You know what I mean?
Early days of evolution, like they knew the species changed over time, but they weren't quite sure why. And this was one of the ways that they tried to explain it. Like they would argue that giraffes grew long necks because they would stretch their necks trying to reach the highest leaves. And because they stretched their necks so much, their offsprings were then born with longer necks. Basically, Lysenko...
I mean, I'm not going to lie. Like before you really knew about a lot of genetics and mutations and how slow actually speciation is in the long run. Like if you take all that out, the Lamarckian stuff can, I guess, make sense. But once we find all these new scientific things, they had to be, you know, discarded.
Believe that it was the environment alone that shapes animals and plants. So, you know,
like if I go and tan a lot the rest of my life, and I'm already pale,
you can change them any way you want. So, as head of Soviet agriculture, he set out to educate Soviet crops to sprout at different times of the year. This is why he did things like soaking them in freezing water. He said that future generations of crops would remember these environmental cues and then inherit beneficial traits.
Well, it's literally Lamarckian seeds,
is that,
germination and stuff.
It's impossible. As Sam Keen wrote in the Atlantic in 2017, quote,
now there's a scientist. You gotta look like that guy. You don't give a crap about, I mean, that's maybe style to him, but like, you're not going in with the modern stuff. You just do the thing that you think looks fashionable when you eventually need to get out of your, out of your office and go touch some grass and get your picture taken.
Akin to cutting the tail off a cat and then expecting her to give birth to tailless kittens. Okay, so just so that we're all on the same page concerning genetics, here's how genetics actually works. All plants and animals have genes that determine traits passed on.
Write this down, everybody.
For example, humans have around 25,000 to 35,000 genes, and each gene has a special job that the DNA in it tells it to do inside a cell. Genes also come in pairs. Each parent has 2 copies of each of their genes, but each parent only passes along just 1 copy of their genes to their offspring. This makes up the genes that you have and helps determine things like your hair or eye color or how tall or short you'll be.
Remember all this?
But Lysenko didn't believe in
freshman
genes.
Biology.
He promised that his methods would boost crop yields nationwide through massive farms with crops planted extremely close together. And he said that they wouldn't compete against each other because they were of the same species or class. He thought the amount of milk that...
Yes. The seeds have class consciousness. The seeds have class consciousness. It's like the exact opposite of how like nature works that way with, you know, like plant and animal life. It's competition, right?
That a cow produces would determine on how well the cow was treated and not by its genetics. Oh, and he also claimed that cuckoo birds were created by feeding birds hairy caterpillars.
Sick.
That kind of thing. See, that was the thing that everybody liked about him. His theories echoed the language and ideology of communism. You know, like growing plants together was the same as class solidarity, or getting cows to produce more milk because they were treated well was similar to treating workers better. And because they were so obsessed with proving that communism was superior, even the natural order of things, Stalin implemented these ideas throughout all of Soviet agriculture. And the result, Almost everything grown under these methods died or rotted. So yeah, he told farmers that planting each generation of seeds closer and closer together would just get them used to the reduction in growing room, and then more could be grown in smaller plots of land. What this actually did is it caused crops to compete for nutrients and root space, and the result was stunted growth. And they also told farmers to dig really deep into the soil, up to 2 meters compared to the 10 or 20 centimeters that they previously would do. And the reason given for this was that it would bring up more fertile soil, but actually, the most fertile soil is the topsoil up on top, so the crops suffered.
Has the most nutrients.
So sure, Stalin is to blame for the famines that killed at least 7 million people, but it was Lysenko's ideas that prolonged the famines.
Well, but he put him in charge. And did Stalin have, he must have been aware of some of this other stuff.
Death from the famines peaked from 1932 to 1933. 4 years later, there was a 163-fold increase in farmland using Lysenko's methods, and food production was even lower than before. During the early 30s, between Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, around 15 million people died.
Nothing's growing.
But then in the late 1950s, China faced its own catch-up moment where they wanted to get as industrialized as the rest of the world. So they used many of the same policies that Stalin did, because again, they were actually kind of successful.
And I know this isn't the point of his video, but I want to make sure context is important too. There were political, social reasons too for some of these. Remember, the Soviet government also controls the distribution of food. So because it's collectivized and it's the decisions are overseen by these collectives, that food can be moved to other places, right? And with like Ukraine as well, a lot of food, because Ukraine was maybe the most productive of all of the, like, especially wheat production, because the agriculture, how historically successful it's been. And a lot of that food was taken away from that region to feed other places. So there were decisions made. It wasn't just about, again, the lack of the science behind it. There were actual decisions made that made these famines happen as well. So you got to add them together.
Economically. Unfortunately, this included Lysenko's ideas. And this is kind of where I started this video. Estimates of the Great Chinese Famine go as high as 55 million people, with at least 30 million people on the low end, which even that would double what the USSR went through.
Yeah.
And it's easy to hear a number like that.
30 million is what I've thrown around. I always tell students, though, that stuff like that, you can never get a full picture of. It can be higher, it can be lower. And if a state can definitely control a very negative message, if they have that ability to, they're probably not going to want it shown on the high end, especially if it can get out, internationally, because it's going to hurt your PR.
And just kind of tune out. But some of the stories that came out of China during that time were just horrendous. Some peasants resorted to eating tree bark, bird droppings, and each other. Cannibalism ran rampant, which is why my parents' generation, all those years later, were still talking about starving children in China. It was that bad, dude.
You'd think China
Stalin
would
died in
do
1953.
Because I already saw
their new leader, Nikita Khrushchev,
Stalin's
supported
policies.
Lysenko. At first.
Interesting, especially because Khrushchev was, of course, hardcore communist, but he was also the anti-Stalin, right? De-Stalinization. He reversed a lot of the policies of Joseph Stalin, and it looks like that is one of the things he held on to.
Soviet scientists emerged and started to debunk Lysenko's claims, and they brought to light how he used his political influence to denounce anybody who criticized him. Nobel Peace Prize recipient and physicist Andrei Sakura spoke to the General Assembly of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1964 and countered Lysenko's ideas, at one point saying, quote, "He is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudoscientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for the defamation, firing, arrest, even death of many genuine scientists."
It's a shame, especially if you're a citizen of the Soviet Union, because there were plenty of things scientifically that the Soviet Union is going to be good at. Okay, with some of their engineering, some of just other science, atomic science, energy, some of those kind of things. But the thing that was the most important, which was the science that helps create the thing you need to survive, they're horrible at. Like, be wrong at something else, but not food.
This was the beginning of the end for Lysenko. After this speech, the media started to spread anti-Lysenko articles that caused him to be disgraced. He was removed from his directorship in 1965,
he got fired.
And he died in 1976.
Yet, go to the gulag. The Chinese
he's gaining in popularity again. There has been a recent trend in Russian science of kind of rethinking his role in the famines. According to the book Lesenko's Ghost by Lauren Graham, Lesenko's rehabilitation is due to a few things. First of all, sympathies to Stalin, the growing influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the rise in popularity of modern epigenetics.
So basically just the end of the Soviet Union brought him back. Because the Orthodox Church comes back into power, had been totally pushed on the underground. And Stalin becoming further and further, his death further and further from when that happened to today. Stalin is being looked at again now by future generations for his policies and things like that, whether people thought they were positive or, negative.
So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we have thousands of genes, but not all of them are active at once. Some of these genes get turned on or off inside of cells, and the study of these changes is called epigenetics. One thing that turns genes on or off are environmental cues. And these environmentally driven changes can, yes, pass from a parent to its offspring. In other words, the way you live your life, the choices you make, can actually affect the genes that you pass on to your kids. That sounds exactly like what Lysenko is saying. And to some people, this is
sounds
validation
like
of his ideas.
Lamarchianism,
But if you look at his work, it shows that he didn't predict epigenetics in any important way. In fact, he claimed that genes didn't exist, and the whole basis of epigenetics is that they do. Plus, epigenetic changes that tend to pass from parent to offspring do disappear after a few generations. They're not permanent, which is the opposite of what Lysenko believed. But the main reason that Lysenko's ideas are becoming popular again is because Lysenko was extremely anti-West. And Russia's in a bit of an anti-West phase right now.
Oh, we're throwing the mod pole, the modern politics.
Lysenko is presented as a hero to the Russians because he stood up
is Putin
to Western science.
Lysenkoist?
I mean, I get that, but I don't know. Isn't there somebody else you can look up to who didn't contribute to, mass cannibalism? Now, to be fair to Lysenko, he did not personally kill 70 million people, and the famines that did weren't all his fault. There were mountains of bad ideas and mismanagement that led to those disasters. His were just some of them. But is it fair to call him the worst scientist of all time? I mean, in terms of...
one of the most negatively impactful scientists. Fair?
Count, maybe you'd be hard pressed to find somebody whose ideas have killed more people. But in terms of just, bad at the job.
Let me know down below. What do you think? Can anyone else match up to this, to scientists that have had worse effects than this guy?
Job of being a scientist?
Post down below.
Yes.
Yeah?
Definitely. He started with a conclusion and then changed the facts to fit what he wanted to be true. And then he suppressed the peer review process.
Make sure you're...
That's like how science works. He stopped science from working.
Yeah,
and he based his science on his political beliefs. I mean, he said that genetics was too capitalist. What does that even mean? Yeah, old Trofim and all his study never fully understood the fundamentals of science. If only he'd had Brilliant back then. How many millions of lives could have been saved?
Ad time. All right. Yeah, check out Brilliant. All right, let me give you my final thoughts. Okay, so overall, what I'm going to be able to, I think, take away from this is, again, a little bit more of the science behind these horrible famines that have been attached to, Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, right? And you probably didn't know you're going to get this much science in a Mr. Terry history video, huh? But I mean, all these stuff get married together in history. It's how it works. But it's good to be able to get, as many things as possible into explaining historical events. We want a one size fits all. There's one reason why things happen, because it's easy, right? That's what we want. We want history to be simplified. We want our lives and the world to be simplified and be able to be explained simply, right? But that's not reality, right? History, reality, everything is nuanced. Everything is nuanced. And as teachers, we try to do, hopefully do a good job at explaining the nuance, right? Being able to explain the nuance and the many different causes and effects of events in history, so we can get as accurate as possible, right? But this will be good. So I can, bring this up a little bit more about how just the agricultural practices at these times, how those were also and how those came to be. But he did also, did a good job of also explaining, though, that the scientists and like this, what's it called, fertilization, the reason they're doing that, it was because the guy was such a hardcore communist that won favor with, Joseph Stalin, right? So there's a economic and political narrative behind all this too, and you got to tie all that together. Okay. Well, anyways, this was super fascinating. I really enjoyed watching this. So thank you for getting this promoted for the community. Thank you for suggesting the video. And yeah, this is cool when we can make these kind of crossroads of, you know, bringing other subjects into how they influence history. Let's start talking about them. I know it's super helpful for me as a teacher. It's got to be hopefully interesting for you as a viewer and a, you know, history student yourself. All right, again, thank you, Joe. Great video there. The original link is down below. It looks like did a great job there. I have to look more, but yeah, go sub to him, check out his videos. If you see something else again like this, let me know. Let me know if we should watch it together. Okay, and with that, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.